Hey, Mike. Well, we got something new here, sponsorship with probably our favorite software, and according to a recent survey, 30% of evangelical churchgoers want more in-depth teaching like we do here at the Naked Bible Podcast. And if you want to go deeper, and there's nothing better than we trust than Logos, it's the Bible study platform, period.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Logos, having worked there a long time, I know Logos fuses powerful technology with biblical resources. You can access Bibles and search tools, commentaries, seminary-level courses now with mobile ed, and even audiobooks right on your phone, tablet, or desktop.
Yeah, and they have over 200,000 digital books. It's crazy. I mean, the power, the technology, and the search, and all the cross-references. I honestly don't know how you could go to the depth that you can get studying the Bible if you don't use Logos software.
Well, I think that's the point. You can't. There's no other platform like it. I can remember when I worked there when we crossed 100,000 resources, but now it's double, since I've even been there. So what the difference is that Logos editions of books have been turbocharged with powerful data that connect them with the rest of your library. So everything in the library is completely interconnected. This is not like an ebook or a Kindle book or a PDF or anything like that. It's so far beyond that people don't really realize it until they've actually gotten into it. So whether you're comparing Bible translations or tackling tough topics, studying deep theological issues, Logos is going to have you covered no matter what. And then that's before you even get to original language resources. And one of the crucial tools in Logos are the reverse interlinears, where you don't even have to know Greek and Hebrew to run searches in Greek and Hebrew, tap into the original languages. And Logos will even help you pronounce the words.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you're preparing a sermon or a Bible study, I don't know how you don't use Logos to get your study done.
Yeah, I use it literally. I use it every day. I use it hours every day. No exaggeration. I use Logos every day. I'm very familiar with it. I mean, people know that. And there's just nothing like it on the planet.
I mean, if you're serious about Bible study, there's no other software tool out there that will get you as deeper than Logos.
Yep, and I'm asked all the time in email about Bible study tools. And, having been on the podcast for all these years, how many times have you heard me say you need to invest in resources? If you're serious about Bible study, you must invest in resources and tools. And this is it. And I get asked all the time, this question, my answer is always the same. You need to get Logos. And, people sometimes balk at, the affordability question because Logos packages, there's so much in them and they can be expensive. But now Logos is more than affordable. You can get started for just $49. And that's always what I tell people. Get into the platform low and then spend extra money on the books and resources that you want. And now is the perfect time to do that. Just $49.
Yes, and if you want to support the Naked Bible Podcast and what we do here, please go get the Logos software now at logos.com/nakedbible. For $49, get started. And like Mike said, you can build up your library over time, but there's no better time than now to support our show and Logos by going to logos.com/nakedbible. For $49, you can get started right now, Mike. So we encourage all of our listeners, go do it, and you'll be thankful that you did.
Yep, absolutely.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 434, the Epistle of Jude, part 3. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, what's going on?
No, not a whole lot. We are through Stranger Things, though.
Yeah.
I figured you would be asking that.
Mm-hmm. And your thoughts?
I would say I thought it was good, but not quite at the level of the first 3 seasons.
Okay.
I kind of judge these things by how many memorable scenes there are and different things like that, and but without giving away any spoilers. The scene with Murray in the last installment in the Russian prison was the best one. So, but yeah, I mean it was good. It was good. It's just a hard act to follow. First 3 seasons were so good.
Yeah, I'm going to say Eddie shredding the guitar was my favorite scene. So I enjoyed him. He was a good addition to this season, so that was fun.
Yeah. Well, again, we don't want to do any spoilers here, but yeah, my kids thought he was a good addition too.
Yeah, the whole Hellfire Club. It's funny that D&D. See, what's funny, I remember that in the 80s, I was a kid. I was their age as a kid at that time, and I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons because I too heard it was satanic, and I was scared of it, and I didn't know anything about the game, and we didn't have the internet back then. I had 3 channels on TV, things like that. So for the longest time, I really thought it was some kind of satanic, Ouija board game or something. So it's funny,
right? Not just for geeks, yeah.
Yeah. So that whole in the show, when the jock thought they were demon worshippers or whatever, playing the game. So I was like, that's spot on. That's exactly what the mentality was at the time. And I remember thinking that way as well as a kid. They nailed that part.
I remember hearing that, but I mean, I never played it either, but it didn't get too much hype where I was at school, but I know there were kids that played it, but you'd hear every now and then something like that.
Yeah. Taking it a little too serious. Well, Jude is going to be way better than D&D game. I mean, with how much is packed into this little letter.
Yeah. And today, Jude 6 is almost like its own Hellfire Club. Well, today we are going to hit Jude 6. I'm actually going to spend some time in verse 8 as well, but next time we'll hit verses 7 and 8. It's just kind of hard to know what to split up and what to sort of focus on in this book because it's so compact. I don't know. It's kind of presents some difficulties because the writer kind of assumes things of his audience that I just wonder can we assume today that we all know about this or that, especially like the book of Enoch. We're going to spend time talking about Enoch today again too. But Jude 6 for the most part today. We might as well just start it off by reading. I'm going to read verses 4 through 8, but we'll focus on verse 6 with the angels that sin. So beginning in verse 4, it says, "For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people, who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet in like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones." That's Jude 4 through 8. And again, it's not an easy task to know kind of how to split these things out, because verses 6 and 8 sort of play off each other. And we don't have enough time in this episode to hit 6, 7, and 8. So we're going to reserve the Sodom and Gomorrah verse 7, and pick up again with verse 8 next time. But we're going to try to focus on Jude 6. And again, I've already telegraphed we're going to get into verse 8 because verse 8 is something of a commentary on verse 6 in some ways. So if we go to Jude 6, we focus here on the angels who did not stay within their position of authority, in their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. Jude is comparing the false teachers of verse 4, where we began our reading, and their fate to Old Testament typologies. And we discussed that in chapter 2, that Jude's going to be pulling out different events, different personages, different figures from the Old Testament as analogous to the false teachers. Again, to make his point that their doom is certain. They're not going to get away with anything that they've been trying to get away with. And he's going to use a variety of Old Testament, again, events and characters to try to illustrate this. So he's comparing the false teachers of verse 4 to the angels that sinned, and then he's going to compare them to Sodom and Gomorrah. A little later, it'll be Balaam and Cain and Korah. So Jude's going to do a lot of this, again, to paint the false teachers in a certain way. And by analogy, what they're guilty of, by analogy, reason from what they're guilty of as well. Again, sharing the faith. Also be dipping in 2 Peter 2 a little bit to discuss this, which is unavoidable. Listeners are likely aware that 2 Peter 2:4 has the same sort of content in view as in Jude 6, the angels that sinned. And they're also probably aware that the epistles of 2 Peter and Jude have a close content relationship. But in case not, I don't know if this article is publicly accessible or not, but I think it actually is because it's a BBR title, Bulletin for Biblical Research. This is J. Darrell Charles, The Angels Under Reserve in 2 Peter and Jude. And this is from a 2005 issue, way back, volume 15. And what he points out in this, in regard to, again, this relationship between Jude and 2 Peter, he writes, in Jewish tradition, the example of the disenfranchised angels, Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4, appears frequently alongside hard-hearted Israel. Jude 5, he references there. Sodom and Gomorrah, Jude 7, and 2 Peter 2:6. And Noah and the flood in extra-biblical tradition. So basically what he's saying is, just broadly in Jewish tradition, not just the New Testament, but broadly, you see these things lumped together. Again, the angels that sinned, Sodom and Gomorrah, hard-hearted Israel, the flood. It's common for ancient Jewish books of the period to get into this content, mixing all this stuff because, again, sort of the crime and punishment that was involved. And also the whole story of the Watchers were guilty of false teaching. That was one of the main things that they were guilty of. Again, I'm assuming in this audience that this audience is going to know who the Watchers are, and they're going to know about basically the basics of the Enoch story. So I'm not going to just rehearse all that. I'm assuming people have read Unseen Realm and again have dipped into this content before. But again, Charles is just saying this is really common to lump all these things together in Jewish literature of the period. He says, stereotypically, these are employed as types of apostasy upon which divine judgment fell. The angels function in what appear to be similar contexts, since the theme of moral accountability is present in both 2 Peter and Jude. So again, these two epistles in the New Testament are closely related. And so 2 Peter 2:4, Jude 6, they're both going to be dealing with angels that sinned. They're not identical in everything they say, but you put them together, you get the full picture. And you can get even a fuller picture if you, again, start factoring in, the ancient Jewish literature that both Jude and Peter know, and they reference in their epistles in what they're writing. Bauckham, in his commentary on Jude, gets into the details of Jude 6. So I want to include some quotations from scholars in this regard, because I don't want anybody to think this is just Mike's take on Jude 6 or the angels that sinned and, going back to Genesis 6:1-4. No, this is standard academic research going into 2 Peter 2 and Jude 6. I mean, anybody who spends any amount of time in the material is going to know that both these New Testament writers, Peter and Jude, are very, very closely acquainted with Enoch and Enoch's story of the episode of the sons of God in Genesis 6:1-4. Of course, the sons of God in Enoch's version are referred to as Watchers. That's the Second Temple Jewish name for these villains, these characters. So Bauckham gets into the details, and let me just quote from what he says in his Word Biblical Commentary. He says the The angelus are the angels known as watchers, who, according to Jewish tradition, descended from heaven to marry human wives and corrupt the human race in the period before the flood. This was how the account of the sons of God in Genesis 6:1-4 was universally understood as far as our evidence goes, until the mid-2nd century AD. And then he quotes a number of passages: 1 Enoch 6-19, 1 Enoch 21, 1 Enoch 86-88, and again a bunch of other passages with something from Jubilees, a few Dead Sea Scrolls, some Targums, the Testament of Reuben, Testament of Naphtali. I mean, there's a wide variety of Second Temple Jewish literature where you find this story. And again, there's no ambiguity here. Up until the 2nd century AD, everybody understood that the sons of God of Genesis 6 were supernatural beings, angelic beings. There was no Sethite view, none of that nonsense, that you run into so frequently in the church today. Nobody in antiquity, up until, again, well into the 200s AD, a couple hundred years after, again, the birth of the early church, they all knew what this was. They all knew what it was talking about and didn't run away from it. So Bauckham writes, picking up with him again, Jude's reference is directly dependent on 1 Enoch 6-19, which is the earliest extant account of the fall of the Watchers from the early 2nd century BC at the latest. And he shows himself closely familiar with those chapters. They tell how in the days of Jared or Yared, Genesis 5:18, 200 angels under the leadership of Shemichaza and Asael, filled with lust for the beautiful daughters of men, descended on Mount Hermon and took human wives. Their children, the giants, ravaged the earth, and the fallen angels taught men forbidden knowledge and all kinds of sin. And they were therefore responsible for the total corruption of the world on account of which God sent the flood. The watchers were punished by being bound under the earth until the day of judgment, when they will be cast into Gehenna. Their children, the giants, were condemned to destroy each other in battle. 1 Enoch 10:9. But their spirits became the evil spirits responsible for all evil in the world between the flood and the day of the judgment. That's 1 Enoch 15:8-16:1. It is clear that for the author of these chapters, the judgment of the watchers and the men at the time of the flood prefigured the final elimination of all evil at the last judgment. The parallel will also have been in Jude's mind when he used the watchers as a type of the false teachers of the last days. It's very clear that Jude, and when he refers to the angels, very clear, angels that sinned, Jude clearly accepts the sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4 as supernatural beings. And there's simply no escape from this other than to simply ignore the text at this point or to make up some other angelic sin and then add it to the Old Testament. You get to create your own scripture. And I don't want to sound too flippant there, but I don't mind sounding at least a little bit flippant because that's essentially what people do. They come up with this third of the angels revolting and all that sort of stuff. There is no account of this, of a third of the angels rebelling in the Old Testament. Zero. It shows up nowhere. The only time you get that language is Revelation 12, and it's in response to a war. It's about a war in heaven in response to the birth of the Christ child. It has nothing to do with the events before the flood. Again, these are the facts of the text. And if you just don't like it, well, that's too bad, because that's just the way it is. These are the facts of the text, and everybody in the ancient world, again, knew this. They didn't try to run from it or hide from it. So Jude clearly accepts, again, sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4 were supernatural beings. He calls them angels. There's an explicit parallel in 2 Peter 2, verses 4-6, and that includes both angels that sinned before the flood came and Sodom and Gomorrah, also as Old Testament analogies to false teachers, just like Jude. All scholars, and I'm serious about this, are aware of the tight overlap between Jude and 2 Peter and these things. There's no ambiguity here. Nobody's wondering, how to take these things. This is one of the few, things in Scripture where there's consensus agreement because, frankly, the content is so obvious. In the 2 Peter 2 reference, the sin of the angels doesn't get much of a description. In fact, let's just go there real quickly. We'll go to 2 Peter 2:4. I'll read it just in case it's not clear in the minds of listeners, 2 Peter 2:4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, the verb there is Tartarus, tartarao. Cast them into Tartarus is the verb. And Tartarus was the place where the Titans of Greek religion wound up, again, in response to their rebellion. If God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, cast them into hell, the ESV has, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, then so on and so forth. So that's 2 Peter 2:4-7. It reads just like Jude, 6-8. You get the same thematic elements there. The angels that sinned, Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, you got the timing with the flood there, so on and so forth. So again, the scholars are very aware that 2 Peter 2 and Jude 6, specifically 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 are very close in terms of their content. But in 2 Peter 2, we don't really get a specific description of the sin. We do get a description, however, of the sensuality of the false teachers that both precedes and follows the description. The false teachers in 2 Peter 2 are described that way in 2 Peter 2:1-2 and 2 Peter 2:9-10. There's something about their character that has something to do with sexual immorality. And that theme is more pronounced in the Jude passage. Again, going back to Jude 6, our verse for the day. The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in chains under gloomy darkness until judgment of the great day. You get down to verse 8, and it talks about defiling the flesh. Verse 7 talks about Sodom and Gomorrah likewise, quote unquote, likewise, like the angels who sinned. Indulge in sexual immorality, so on and so forth, unnatural desire. So there's something about that element in both Jude and 2 Peter that sort of works its way into the description. In some cases, it's more overt than others. In 2 Peter 2:4, you get specifically a reference to sensuality. Let's just go back there. If God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus or into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Again, so on and so forth with Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. You get this situation where in verse 7, if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, you get these references to sensuality, and then the whole Sodom and Gomorrah episode as well. And you get the angels that sinned, again, casting them into Tartarus. And then in Jude 6, the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority. Just as verse 7, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities likewise indulged in sexual immorality. Again, it's just a recurring theme, through on, and that makes sense in light of Genesis 6:1-4. Okay, Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God, the daughters of men. Again, a forbidden transgressive relationship there that results in the Nephilim and the giants and so on and so forth. And again, all of these details of the story get amplified, get blown up in the book of Enoch in lots of detail. But this is again part of the context, part of the important context, which again it's just inescapable as far as this element of it. And again, it makes sense because it's referencing Genesis 6:1-4. There is no other angelic sin that would have involved any sort of sexual immorality or any language like that back in the Old Testament, except for Genesis 6:1-4. There just isn't any. I want to spend a little bit more time on this, specifically in 2 Peter 2:7. Again, not to belabor the point too much, but again, I want the reason I'm doing this again is to reinforce the reality that there is no angelic sin that has something to do with sexual immorality other than Genesis 6:1-4. This is the only thing that Peter could have in his head when he's writing this. So if you go to 2 Peter 2:7, and again, this is going to be consistent with what we're reading in Jude. when you get to the Sodom and Gomorrah story in verse 7 in 2 Peter 2. If he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. Sensual conduct there is a Greek term, asolgeia. And again, the term is very clear. BDAG, which is the standard lexicon for New Testament study, defines the term as just generally a lack of self-constraint, which involves one in conduct that violates all bounds of what is socially acceptable, to live licentiously. And of 2 Peter 2, BDAG, has that specifically referenced here as many will follow in their licentious tracks. And he has some notes from other passages as well. The term is used in the New Testament in Romans 13:13 with koite. We get our word coitus from it. Again, a reference to the sexual act. And it's also used elsewhere with porneia, or some of these porn root terms in the New Testament. So it's very clear, again, that what we have here has something to do with, again, there's a sexual flavor to it, a sexual content to it. Another source, the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis, of this term of asolgeia, notes again that it means licentiousness or lewdness or indecency. And specifically, the contributor there writes this: in the Septuagint, asolgeia occurs only twice, both times in the Apocrypha, 3rd Maccabees 2:26 and Wisdom 14:26. In both contexts, one is with Ptolemy's dissolute behavior sexually, and Wisdom 14:26 occurs with the word moikeia, which is the word for adultery. It occurs with other terms dealing with sexual immorality. The term is used by Josephus 10 times in some instances of intemperate behavior generally, but other times with reference to sexual conduct. Specifically, the Wars of the Jews has a reference to that, 2.121. Philo uses it 3 times. I'm not going to go through all these references, but Second Temple Jewish literature uses this term in Greek, and in the Greek material there, to refer to licentious behavior of a sexual nature. So the word, going down to the entry here in NID and TTE, the contributor notes this: the word occurs 10 times in the New Testament, all but one instance, Mark 7:22, being found in the Epistles. The general meaning, lack of moral restraint, quote unquote, is possible in Mark 7:22, in a list next to deceit and envy, and Ephesians 4:19. But in every other passage, the term is found either next to words that explicitly refer to sexual immorality, Romans 13:13, 2 Corinthians 12:21, Galatians 5:19, 1 Peter 4:3, 2 Peter 2:18, or in contexts that indicate the same thing, again, indicate sexual immorality, 2 Peter 2:7, 2 Peter 2:18, Jude 4, and Jude 7 and 8. Again, I'm belaboring this point because, you have people that still, especially within evangelicalism, try to approach Jude 6, the angels that sinned, and 2 Peter 2:4, again, the angels that sinned, and try to come up with some other, with it referring to something other than Genesis 6:1 through 4. I'm sorry, but it can't be done. It's the only sin of a group of angels, just generally, in the entire Old Testament, and it's the only sin of a group of angels, more specifically, that has some kind of sexual content to it. There's only one candidate. It's Genesis 6:1 through 4. So let's get back into Jude again. I don't want to belabor it too much, but people just deny it. They don't want Peter. They don't want Jude, again, for our purposes today, to be affirming Genesis 6:1 through 4 as supernatural beings, but he does. Sorry, he just does. So the Peter parallel is important, I think, because of verse 8, which in Jude 8 read this: yet in like manner, these people, again, these false teachers, relying on their dreams, they defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious one. So what Jude does is he portrays the false teachers in 3 ways. They defile the flesh, they reject authority, and they blaspheme the glorious ones. But he has this phrase in here that they do this in like manner. Likewise, to what? Well, this is Jude 8, to what has preceded. That is the angels that sinned, and then, of course, the Sodom and Gomorrah story. So the defile the flesh line in verse 8, in Jude 8, and earlier, again, the relationship between Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2:4, and the sexual context there. I think if we view all these things together, Jude 6, Jude 8, 2 Peter 2:4, 2 Peter 2:7, we get a fuller picture of what not only how the writers are portraying the false teachers, that again, their false teaching has something to do with sexual immorality and, just corrupting people that way. But it also, again, provides a real strong foothold back to Genesis 6:1-4. So I'm going to camp a little bit on verse 8 a little bit, even though our focus is the angels that sinned in Jude 6, because I think verse 8 allows us to interpret verse 6 a little bit better. So let's just do that. Jude 8 essentially describes the sin of the angels and of Sodom and Gomorrah three ways. Mention it again: defilement of the flesh, reject authority, blaspheme the glorious ones. And so what I'm going to suggest is that these elements, we've already talked about the defilement of the flesh enough. We're not going to rabbit trail back into that. But other than the sexual nature of the sin, there are two other things going on here that, again, we can take back to Genesis 6:1-4. We can take back, again, to Jude 6 and even into 2 Peter 2 and talk about what this original crime was. It wasn't just the sexual transgression. It was there was more going on here. So by rejecting authority, it has something to do with a hunger for autonomy. The angels resisting the authority of God over them. And of course, in Sodom and Gomorrah's case, the cities have already rejected God's will for general behavior approved by God. We know that from the story. We'll cover it. We'll cover the Sodom and Gomorrah story next time. But Genesis 18 makes that clear. There's nobody righteous in the city. So they've clearly rejected God's morality in every way. And then not only do they reject the authority of God over them, but they also blaspheme the glorious ones. And this again, I think it helps us to see a little bit more what's going on and how the transgression of Genesis 6:1-4 was understood, and how we can be reading, again, the angelic sin of Jude 6 a little bit differently too. There's something blasphemous going on here, where the angels that sin blaspheme God and they diminish the loyalty of the rest of the heavenly host. They essentially snub their noses at God and those who are on God's side. And of course, in Sodom and Gomorrah's case, as we'll find out next time, the connection point there may very well be that the men of the city of Sodom desire to sexually take the two men who are actually angels in the story. And that may be, again, the way that the glorious ones are blasphemed. But we'll hit that. We'll hit that next time. Let's take this all back to Jude 6. The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling. I mean, you look at that description, they didn't stay within their position of authority. Well, that sounds again like they're rejecting authority in verse 8. Again, verse 6 and verse 8, there's some relationship there. And they left their proper dwelling. Again, that's a rejection of authority. And what I'm also going to suggest to you that it does have something to do with blasphemy as well. And the rest of verse 6, factoring verse 8 into the description of the sin, what did the angels do? They don't stay within their own position of authority. The Greek term there is arche. They don't stay within their own arche, which generally means rule. But they left their proper dwelling. The word there, the Greek word there is oiketerion. They leave home, essentially, which amounts to rejecting the authority put over them. In verse 8, they reject the lordship that's put over them. The Greek word there is kuriotes, and they wind up blaspheming the glorious ones there at the end of verse 8. So I want to take each one of these element by element. And again, you'll just see some of the details that emerge from this. again, what we're doing is we're comparing Jude 6. We're allowing Jude 8 to be a bit of a commentary on it. And also we're looping in 2 Peter 2 and, of course, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So let's take the first one. Did not stay within their own position of authority here in Jude 8. They didn't stay within their own arche, their own rule. Herb Bateman in his commentary has a nice summary paragraph of this. I'm going to read to you. He says the noun domain, or again, the ESV has authority, could mean that they were authority figures or cosmic rulers. And the word is arche. For instance, one Dead Sea Scroll states, peace and blessing for the lot of God to exalt the authority of Michael among the gods and the dominion of Israel among all flesh. That's the War Scroll, by the way. And it's paralleled by 1 Enoch 82. Naturally, Michael is the archangel who appears later in Jude 9. The point here is simply this: an angel is given authority or position of authority. Meaning angels have authority. In fact, Bateman continues, the New Testament speaks of angelic principalities and powers. Romans 8:38, Colossians 2:15, for example. This is not to say that there was a civil war in heaven and angels were cast out. Again, it's good because the Old Testament doesn't record that anywhere. So he's saying it's not to say that, but rather that they left on their own accord as a form of rebellion against God. Thus, the term might mean angels did not keep their office or position of rulership. Yet Jude's parallelism seems to suggest that these celestial beings did not stay within their sphere of official activity. They did not maintain their rightful place of influence, or quite simply did not remain in their proper domain. In essence, they left heaven, and they do it voluntarily. Again, this doesn't have anything to do with a war in heaven. There is no such passage in the Old Testament. But you go back to Genesis 6, 1 through 4. There's no sense that they're being, kicked out of heaven, and now we're going to go down to earth and have our way with human women. There's just, that isn't the sense that you get at all. They do what they do voluntarily. They choose to leave their own jobs, their own position of authority, their own proper place. They violate, again, God's sovereignty over them. And Bauckham, in his commentary, concurs with that. He says, arcane here means a position of heavenly power or sphere of dominion, which the angels exercised over the world in the service of God. Again, he has a lot of references in Jubilees and Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls to this. The angels exercise certain, again, dominion over the world in the service of God and as cosmic powers. Again, he's relating this in part to some of the terminology that's used in the New Testament of angels as authorities and dominions and rulers of the power of the air. And again, some of these references that we're used to, that we're familiar with. So angels, again, have some kind of status, some kind of ruling authority. And these, in Jude 6, just decide to leave it. They abandon it. They forsake it. They're apostates. This is what apostates do. They leave something. They abandon it. And that's what they do. Second line from Jude 8, they leave their proper dwelling. Again, the Greek term here is oikete, right out of first. And again, most of your commentators note this a lot dealing with the Greek text, but it actually is right out of 1 Enoch. So the idea of leaving, just hold that verb in your head, leaving, and leaving their proper dwelling. So specifically, Bauckham writes this: the Greek term apolypontos, ta idion oiketerion, that is, abandon their proper dwelling, comes from 1 Enoch 12:4 and 1 Enoch 15:3, where you left, and the angels left. That's the same verb as apolypontos. Here it's apelipete. But they leave their first estate. They leave, again, something. They leave where they're supposed to be, the high, holy, and eternal heaven. And then in 1 Enoch 15:7, the thing that they leave is called their dwelling, the katoikesis. Again, it's very similar to oiketerion. And they're in the same family, family of words that mean house or household dwelling, that kind of thing. So it's very evident that Jude, again, is tracking with Enoch in Greek, very closely. And Bauckham says these two phrases in synonymous parallelism stress the apostasy of the angels, which Jude intends to compare with that of false teachers. The fact that sexual immorality was also involved in the angel's sin will become apparent in verse 7, again, Jude 7, which we've already noted. Next, they rejected authority. They rejected the lordship over them. And the word here is kuriotes. It's related to the word for Lord, kurios. Gene Green in his commentary writes this. He says, the second accusation Jude levies against the heretics, again, both the heretics and, of course, by default, by analogy, against the angels that sinned as well. The second accusation Jude levies against the heretics is that they revolt against lordship, although kuriotes may refer to angelic beings, as is in the case of Colossians 1:16 and Ephesians 1:21. Here, as in 2 Peter 2:10, it denotes the ruling power of the Lord himself. So they reject Christ's lordship, God's lordship itself when they're doing this. So the angels that sin, back in Genesis 6:1-4, it's not just that they're driven by irrational lust or something like this. Again, that's a big part of it. But they have to make a deliberate decision to be apostate and to forsake the authority that they did have and to leave, again, the proper state, the proper dwelling that God had assigned to them. They just chuck it all. It's sort of, to use the King James language, it's a high-handed sin. It's deliberate, it's intentional, it's purposeful, it's intentional apostasy. To make the point a little bit more, Green rabbit trails a little bit on the word reject. He writes this. Jude picks up a verb here, atheteo, found 60 times in the Septuagint, which, though it is used to translate 17 different terms in the Hebrew Scriptures, most commonly stands for Hebrew bagad, to deceive, to be unfaithful, to betray, and pasha, to defect or revolt, with the result that in biblical usage this verb almost always means to be unfaithful, to revolt, or to betray in the sense of deceive or scorn. Once again, the question of authority is brought to the fore as Jude accuses these heretics not only of violating established norms, but also of revolting against the authority of the Lord himself. As the archetypal examples of sin, verse Jude 5-7, they have broken faith. Again, and those archetypal examples are the angels in Sodom and Gomorrah. They do what they do intentionally. It's not an accident. So to use the King James language, it's a high-handed sin. It's very intentional, very deliberate. Further and lastly, the angels that sinned, and by extension the false teachers, are guilty of, quote, blaspheming the glorious ones. Now this has kind of an interesting twist to it, as Green points out in his commentary. Identifying the glorious ones has been controversial among commentators. Commentators disagree as to who the glorious ones are. Some commentators opt for human dignitaries, which makes little sense if an analogy is being struck between human false teachers and angels that sinned. And if the analogy has angels in view, you would think that part of the analogy as well in verse 8, the glorious ones would, those would be supernatural beings as well. And that's where other commentators are, people like Bauckham and Neri and J.N.D. Kelly. Again, some of your major commentators on Jude. Herb Bateman is going to be the same way. I believe Herb takes the same position. But some of these major commentaries, they're going to see the glorious ones as supernatural beings. They're angelic beings. And I'm with them, certainly. I think that makes the most sense. Green, here's the bit of a twist, makes the salient and, in my mind, decisive observation when he writes this. He says, Jude's idea is adopted by the book's oldest interpreter, 2 Peter. In 2 Peter 2:10-11, the glories are very clearly angelic beings. So if you're looking at Jude and you wonder, who are the glorious ones? If you go over to 2 Peter 2:10-11, the glorious ones, the glories, are clearly angelic beings there in that passage. So again, we should allow Scripture to interpret Scripture here. I think it's also interesting, and this is another note that Green has, is that he discovers that in the Septuagint of Exodus 15:11, and this is a familiar passage, again, for those who have read Unseen Realm or have done anything with divine counsel stuff. Exodus 15:11, this is the verse. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? It's among the Elim. It's very clearly plural Elim. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? Again, the Elim there are the glorious ones. Translates plural Elim, the gods, as glories, or the glorious ones. So if we take the plural Elim there as a reference to the divine counsel, which you more or less have to, this amounts to an angelic transgression, not only against the Most High, but also against the council itself, the heavenly host. And again, that's where you get this idea of blaspheming the glorious ones. So these angels that sinned way back in Genesis 6:1-4, that are serving as these prototypical examples, prototypical archetypal analogy to the false teachers here. I mean, they not only, again, do what they do with boots on the ground, but they defect. They snub the authority of God himself and, again, dismiss the rest of the loyal heavenly host of the council. They rebel against everybody. It's an all or nothing proposition. They're not maintaining relationships, again, within the heavenly host here while they're doing this. They rebel. They betray really the whole system, the whole council, the Most High and his heavenly host. Green adds some other thoughts to this observation. He writes this. He says, the contrast that Jude sets up between the heretic's behavior and that of Michael, which is coming a little bit later in Jude, who did not blaspheme the devil in verses 9 and 10, points in the direction of understanding these glories as supernatural beings. This interpretation also finds support, as Bauckham notes, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where angels are called glories. They're specifically called the glorious ones. In 1QH, that's 1Q Hodiot 10:8, and perhaps 11Q Psalm of Zion, which is 11Q5. Again, I'm not going to read through all the Dead Sea Scroll nomenclature here, but there are Dead Sea Scrolls that call the angels glories, or glorious ones. You get the same thing happen in 2 Enoch 22. You get it happen in Ascension of Isaiah 9:32. Jude's nomenclature, Green says, is understandable in light of the attribution of glory to angels just generally. Revelation 18:1, you get this. You get glory language attached to angels. And again, other Second Temple Jewish texts, Testament of Levi and Philo, so on and so forth. This is an idea rooted in the Old Testament where the cherubim, is the bearer, the supporter of the divine kavod, the divine glory. Of course, that's Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel 9, Ezekiel 10, several places in Ezekiel 10, specifically verses 4, 18, and 22, so on and so forth. I mean, you get this idea that, again, within the heavenly throne room of God, within the heavenly council room of God, you have the occupants of the throne room there associated with the glory of the Lord. Well, of course, it's going to be a divine council, context, and the angels that sin rebel against all of it. So it's a very high-handed sin, very deliberate, very intentional. It's not accidental. And it's not that they were deceived or misled. They do it willingly. They are apostates. And this is what Jude wants people to see. He wants to use the example of the angels that sinned, as bad as that was, and use that as a foil for describing the false teachers. Now, how this relates to false teachers is that their teaching is opposed to the body of truth. In other words, the faith, once delivered to the holy ones, to the saints, to the church, back in Jude 3. That body of truth once handed down by God, and to which the other members of the heavenly host were in agreement. This is essentially a snubbing of the will of God, the will of the Most High, and his council host, the rest of the supernatural family of God. It's another way of describing, just a wholesale, complete defection. So the rest of Jude 6's description again, has secure roots in First Enoch's content as well. I mean, it's inescapable. What Jude is describing is the rebellion of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. He's using that as his example of a horrible defection, of an archetypal sin. He begins his description of the false teachers there. And it's an appropriate description because it's intentional, it's deliberate, and also because the sons of God, the watchers, again, that's Enoch's term, are specifically guilty of teaching human beings false things, how to corrupt themselves. Now, if you remember, again, either from Unseen Realm or maybe Reversing Hermon, another one of my books, this theme becomes very pronounced. If you're again, we can't just rehearse all the Unseen Realm content here in a podcast episode, but I referenced the work of Omar Anos, who was the one who goes back into the original Mesopotamian context for Genesis 6:1 through 4, and in his article on the origin of the Watchers, and that is the explanation for why in Genesis 6. We go from verses 1 through 4, which is, again, the weird stuff, the sons of God, daughters of men, the Nephilim, to verse 5, that the entirety of humankind is wicked. How do you go from the angels that sin, the sin of the sons of God, how do you get from that to just a corporate human wickedness where every thought of the imagination of the heart was only evil continually? Well, you get that because in the original story behind the Genesis 6 episode, the original story of the Mesopotamian Apkallu, this is what they do. They transgress with human women, and they teach humans more effectively how to destroy themselves. They teach them arts of warfare. They teach them astrology. They teach them idolatry. They teach them arts of seduction and immorality. All of these things specifically show up in the Mesopotamian material and in the Book of Enoch and in other Dead Sea Scrolls that comment on this episode. So there's a direct relationship between the sons of God choosing to leave heaven, to leave their task, their rule, to leave whatever their job was and whatever their station was, and come to earth. And it's not just, to create Nephilim, okay? The worst part of it is the way it corrupts humanity just generally. And it turns the hearts of human beings against God and against God's will, against God's morality in all sorts of areas, really in every way, every fundamental way. This is why Jude thinks it's a good analogy to use the false teachers or to use the angels that sinned as an analogy to the false teachers, because the angels that sinned taught false teaching. The story that 6 is playing out, and if there's your understanding there, you're going to have to go back and read Unseen Realm. It's the only solution I have for you. This is why we write the books. Or you could go back and read Reversing Hermon as well. You would find it in there as well. But there's an original Mesopotamian backstory to all of this, to Genesis 6:1 through 4, that accounts for every point: the giants, the sexual element, the false teaching, everything. It accounts for every last piece of it that you get, when you get into the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Book of Enoch and all this stuff, because those sources remember the original context. Genesis 6:1 through 4, skips over it. It just assumes that that the reader knows what's going on here. It assumes the backstory, whereas in the in the Dead Sea Scroll material, that assumption is not made. And in Peter and Jude, the assumption is not made either. Peter and Jude both have the angels that sinned kept in chains of gloomy darkness. That's not in Genesis 6. You know where you find it? You find it not only in the Book of Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find it in the original Mesopotamian Apkallu story. The Mesopotamian Apkallu, which are the bad guys, again, the sons of God, the divine beings that mix themselves with human women in the story. They are sent to the abyss. They are imprisoned in the abyss. Again, every element of what Jude and Peter and Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Mesopotamian backstory and Genesis 6:1 through 4, every last element of all of it, again, you find in these sources. And Peter and Jude just assume that you have the backstory. They assume their readers as just general, again, Jewish, readers that have some acquaintance with Jewish material, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Enoch. They just assume that they know this. On our part, it's harder because we have to recover this content. We have to recover this knowledge, again, by looking at all this other material. Whereas in Jude's readers and 2 Peter's readers, this would have been intuitive because they know the stories really well. They know well enough they can just pick out this or that Greek word, and their readers just know what they're tracking on. So again, Jude 6's description has secure roots in Enoch's content as well. This is the part where they're kept in chains of gloomy darkness. The chains, Bauckham writes, to which Jude refers are very prominent in the tradition of the fall of the Watchers in 1st Enoch. It's mentioned in chapters 13, 14, 54, 56, and 88. And of course, it's also mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Aramaic portions of Enoch. And the angel's imprisonment is a very well-known feature that you don't get from Genesis 6, but you get it from this other material. And the fact that Peter and Jude are including this material in their own inspired writings, in what they're writing in Jude 6 and what they're writing in 2 Peter 2:4, tells you, again, that they assume their readers are familiar with this material and that it's worth quoting. It has explanatory power. Otherwise, they wouldn't include it. They wouldn't dip into it, but they do. And they do it very explicitly. Now, I want to add one more thought here from Bateman. Bateman writes, in Jude, the angels are shackled in eternal chains, whereas Jude's version of the angelic rebels includes being bound in chains. No such punishment of the sons of God is mentioned in Genesis 6, which we just mentioned. You have to go back to the Mesopotamian material for that, which Bateman does not interact with, unfortunately. Bateman writes, Bauckham suggests this concept is very prominent in the tradition of the fall of the Watchers, and of course it is. For instance, and to Michael God said, make known to Shem Yaz and those who are with him who fornicated with the women, that they will die together with them in all their defilement. Bind them for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground until the day of their judgment, and of their consummation until the eternal judgment is concluded. That's 1 Enoch 10:12. And it's very clearly in the Enochian material. When does this judgment occur? Bateman asks. Although the confinement is in darkness, no such description occurs since in 2 Enoch we read, and those men picked me up and brought me to the second heaven, and they showed me, and I saw darkness greater than earthly darkness. Perhaps in darkness refers to the ancient Greeks' underworld or nether darkness, Bateman suggests. Closely related to the Greek concept of Hades is the idea of the underworld as an abyss. Enoch describes, quote, I then saw one seizing that first star, binding his hands and feet, and throwing him into the abyss. This abyss was narrow and deep, empty and dark. So again, in the book of Enoch, we're going to get this in Jude too, the straying angels, the angels of sin, are referred to as falling stars, wandering stars. We're actually going to get that later in the book of Jude. Jude's going to use that phrase too. So it's very clear that he's dipping into Enochian content here. And he's, again, painting a whole portrait, a whole picture of what he views as the villains par excellence, the angels that sinned. They were the ones that sort of started all this off, leaving their first estate, defecting, snubbing their nose at God, blaspheming the glorious ones. This is what they do. That sinned initially, way back in the Genesis account, of course, the traditions that are associated with it, from Mesopotamia and Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on and so forth. In Genesis 6:5, the corruption of humankind on a totality scale. Jude thinks this is the best place to start to show how bad the false teachers really are. And so, again, this is where we wanted to focus today. This is, Jude's point of orientation, I think, is very clear. There's no mistaking what he's referencing in the Old Testament and in this wider ancient literature. And so, next time we're gonna pick up with what he views as almost as bad, or in the same line of badness, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and that's also going to involve angels in a different way. But we'll get to that next time in the next episode when we hit Jude 7 and 8.
Real quick, I just want to bring up, Mike, what frustrates me is some criticism of you is about how people think you have to read this extra literature, the second temple literature, in order to understand the Bible. And that frustrates me so much, because you're not saying you have to go read this to understand the Bible. It just helps put it in context, what the people thought back then. It's like, why do people muddy it up? I mean, how hard is that to understand that reading extra sources informs you on the Bible? It doesn't take away the divinity or anything else.
Right. Why would you not want to read the Word of God in context? Would you want to read it out of context? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, they just think it's some kind of divine context. It's a silo. There's nothing extra that can come in or out. But I don't know.
Right. And Jude, again, as we talked in the very first week, this is one of the reasons why with some figures in the early church, people wondered about the canonical status of Jude, because Jude blows that up. I mean, he goes right into the book of Enoch, and he's going to quote 1 Enoch 1:9 intentionally. We're not there yet. In verses 14 and 15, he quotes Enoch explicitly. But Jude not only quotes him, but he alludes to stuff in Enoch, like we talked about today, all over the place. So Scripture doesn't operate in a vacuum or a silo. It has a context, and the men that God chose to write it, in this case Jude, felt very free to loop this material in for greater understanding, just to give it some context. And that's all we're trying to do.
All right, Mike. Well, don't forget, you can go visit our sponsor at logos.com/nakedbible. Go help support our show and Logos. We would appreciate it. And we look forward to the next installment of Jude. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.